Leningrad stood at the eastern edge of the Baltic Sea, spread across low islands and riverbanks where the Neva met the Gulf of Finland. The city had been built on water and marsh, its foundations driven into soft ground by centuries of labor. Wide avenues crossed canals and industrial districts. Stone embankments lined the river. Shipyards, rail terminals, and factories filled the southern neighborhoods. To the north, forests and lakes extended toward the Finnish border. By the late 1930s, more than 3 million people lived within the city limits. It was the second largest city in the Soviet Union and a major center of manufacturing, science, and culture. The Hermitage Museum held one of the largest art collections in the world. The Kirov plant produced heavy machinery. The Baltic Fleet was anchored in nearby Kronstadt. Life in Leningrad followed the rhythms of a northern climate. Winters were long and dark. The sun remained low even at midday. Summers were brief but bright, with long evenings and cool air from the sea. Residents were accustomed to shortages and political pressure, but daily routines continued. Trams ran on schedule. Markets operated. Schools and factories opened each morning. In June 1941, the city was not isolated. Rail lines connected it to Moscow and the interior. Barges carried supplies across Lake Ladoga. Food arrived by ship from southern ports. There was no sense of permanent vulnerability. The borders felt distant. The war that had begun in Europe 2 years earlier had not yet altered the structure of everyday life in the city. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, Leningrad became a strategic objective almost immediately. The city held symbolic importance as the former capital of the Russian Empire and practical value as a major industrial and naval center. Its capture would secure the northern flank of the German advance and sever Soviet access to the Baltic. At the time of the invasion, Leningrad's population included factory workers, engineers, clerks, students, pensioners, and a large number of women and children. Many men of military age were drafted into the Red Army during the first weeks of fighting. Others were assigned to civil defense units or factory brigades. Evacuation plans existed, but they were limited in scale and poorly coordinated. During the summer of 1941, some civilians were transported east by rail. Entire factory units were dismantled and moved to the Ural region. Children from schools were sent to rural areas. But by August, the transport system was overwhelmed. German forces were advancing rapidly through the Baltic states. Finnish troops moved south from Karelia. Rail lines were cut one by one. By early September, more than 2 million civilians remained inside Leningrad. Among them were elderly residents who could not travel, families who had received no evacuation orders, and workers required to keep key factories operating. The city government encouraged people to stay at their jobs. Industrial output was still considered essential to the war effort. Civil defense preparations focused on air raids rather than long-term isolation. Anti-aircraft batteries were placed on rooftops. Windows were taped. Museums moved their collections into storage. The Hermitage evacuated thousands of artworks, but much remained behind. Food reserves were not expanded significantly. The possibility of total encirclement was not fully anticipated. Most residents had no survival training. They were urban civilians accustomed to centralized supply systems. Water, electricity, and heating came from municipal networks. Food arrived through ration cards distributed at workplaces and housing offices. Few people stored provisions in their apartments. Private gardens were rare. The city's leadership faced conflicting priorities. Military commanders demanded that factories continue production. Civil administrators tried to maintain order and morale. Propaganda emphasized resilience and discipline. Official newspapers reported victories elsewhere on the front. The scale of the threat was not openly discussed. By late August, artillery shells began to land in the southern districts. Air raids damaged warehouses and power stations. Fires broke out near the Badiv food depots, destroying significant reserves of flour and sugar. The loss was not fully disclosed to the public. People noticed changes in small ways. Bread rations were reduced. Trams became less frequent. Queues outside shops grew longer. But daily life continued. Schools reopened in September. Theaters staged performances. Libraries remained open. There was still a belief that the front would stabilize, that relief would arrive before winter. The idea that the city could be cut off for months or years did not yet shape public thinking. Most residents expected hardship, but not the complete collapse of the systems that sustained urban life. On September 8, 1941, German forces captured the town of Schlisselburg on the southern shore of Lake Ladoga. With its fall, the last rail connection into Leningrad was severed. The city was now completely encircled by land. To the north and east, Finnish troops held positions that blocked overland escape. To the south and west, German artillery batteries moved into range of the outer districts. The siege did not begin with a formal announcement. There was no moment when residents were told that all routes were closed. The change appeared gradually, through disruptions that became permanent. Trains stopped arriving. Barges no longer crossed the Neva with supplies. Long-distance communication became unreliable. Food rationing was tightened almost immediately. In September, bread allocations were reduced to 500 grams per day for manual workers and 300 grams for dependents. By October, those amounts were cut again. Meat, dairy, and fats disappeared from official distribution. City officials attempted to organize supply routes across Lake Ladoga, the only remaining gap in the encirclement. But the lake was still open water, vulnerable to air attack. German aircraft targeted barges and docks. Losses were high. The first weeks of isolation were marked by uncertainty rather than panic. Many residents believed the blockade would be temporary. Military bulletins spoke of counteroffensives. Newspapers avoided direct references to starvation or civilian risk. Winter approached faster than expected. Fuel stocks were limited. Coal deliveries had been disrupted. Central heating systems began to fail in outlying districts. Electricity outages became common. By November, the minimum bread ration dropped to 250 grams for workers and 125 grams for children, pensioners, and office employees. The bread itself contained increasing amounts of non-food additives, including sawdust and cellulose. Public spaces emptied. Trams stopped running entirely. People walked long distances to collect rations. Physical weakness became visible in crowds. Falls on icy streets were frequent. Many were unable to stand again without assistance. The siege had become a condition, not an event. Movement was restricted. Information was scarce. The city was sealed into a closed system, dependent on diminishing internal resources and a single, fragile supply line across a lake that would soon freeze. By December 1941, Leningrad functioned on a schedule determined almost entirely by food distribution. Ration cards were issued through workplaces and housing committees. They listed weekly allowances for bread and, when available, small quantities of other items. The cards became the central object of daily planning. Without them, there was no access to official supplies. Queues formed early in the morning outside bakeries and distribution points. People waited for hours in sub-zero temperatures. Some stood in line before dawn to increase their chances of receiving the full allotment. Those who collapsed were often left where they fell. Others stepped around them to maintain their place. Bread remained the primary ration. It was dark, dense, and often damp. The recipe changed depending on available materials. Flour was mixed with bran, oat husks, or wood pulp. The weight remained fixed, but the nutritional value declined. Many people divided their portion into several pieces and ate them slowly over the day to control hunger. Households adapted their routines to conserve energy. Apartments were unheated. Windows were sealed with cardboard and cloth. People slept fully dressed. Water pipes froze. Residents collected snow from courtyards and stairwells, melting it on small stoves fueled by furniture or books. Cooking was limited by the absence of fuel and ingredients. Meals were simple. Some boiled wallpaper paste to extract starch. Leather belts were cut into strips and softened in water. Glue from furniture was dissolved and consumed. These practices were documented in medical reports and diaries preserved after the war. Workplaces continued to operate in reduced form. Factories lacked raw materials and electricity, but attendance was still required to maintain ration eligibility. Many workers were too weak to complete full shifts. Production targets were lowered, but formal schedules remained. Hospitals and clinics were overwhelmed. Starvation-related illnesses included edema, heart failure, and vitamin deficiencies. Doctors lacked medicines and equipment. Mortality records from the winter of 1941-42 show sharp increases in deaths attributed to dystrophy, the term used for severe malnutrition. Schools attempted to remain open, but attendance dropped rapidly. Children were sent home due to cold or fainting. Teachers themselves were affected. Classes were often cancelled without notice. The Lake Ladoga supply route, known later as the Road of Life, began operating more regularly once the lake froze. Trucks crossed the ice under artillery fire. Some sank through thin sections. Others were destroyed by air raids. Despite losses, small quantities of flour and fuel reached the city. Distribution remained uneven. Military units received priority. Civilian allocations were adjusted according to perceived labor value. Pensioners and dependents consistently received the smallest rations. Social structures shifted. Families consolidated into single rooms to share heat. Neighbors exchanged information about distribution times and alternative food sources. Theft increased. Some apartments were looted after residents died. Housing committees attempted to track population changes, but records were incomplete. Official media emphasized endurance and duty. Concerts were broadcast on radio, including a performance of Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony in August 1942, played by an orchestra assembled from surviving musicians. The event was presented as a symbol of cultural resistance. For most residents, daily life became repetitive and narrow. Movement was limited to essential tasks. Conversation focused on food, temperature, and health. Time was measured in rations and energy levels rather than dates. The city continued to exist as an administrative entity, but its internal systems operated at the edge of collapse. The winter of 1941–42 was one of the coldest recorded in Leningrad's history. Temperatures dropped below -30 degrees Celsius. Snow accumulated in streets and courtyards, but there was no capacity to remove it. Public transport had ceased. Most movement took place on foot, through unlit and unheated spaces. Central heating systems failed almost entirely. Without fuel, boilers shut down. Radiators became cold metal fixtures. In many buildings, indoor temperatures fell below freezing. Water froze in pipes and containers. Residents stored small amounts in jars near stoves, rationing each cup. Electricity was available only intermittently. Lighting was restricted to essential facilities. Apartments remained dark for most of the day. Candles were scarce. People adjusted their sleep patterns to daylight hours, resting when visibility disappeared. Food adaptation became systematic. People experimented with substitutes. Seed oil was extracted from flax and cotton waste. Technical gelatin was boiled. Soup was made from grass and tree bark collected from parks. The nutritional content was minimal, but the act of eating itself provided psychological stability. Medical authorities issued guidelines on managing starvation. Citizens were advised to avoid physical exertion, to eat slowly, and to maintain regular meal times even when portions were small. Posters warned against consuming unfamiliar substances, though alternatives were limited. Mental strategies varied. Some residents kept diaries, recording rations and temperatures. Others marked days on calendars. Radio broadcasts provided news and music, though many lacked functioning receivers. Silence became common in apartment blocks. Adaptation also involved changes in social behavior. People spoke less. Emotional responses were muted. Conversations avoided future planning. Immediate needs dominated attention. Expressions of fear or anger were rare, not because they disappeared, but because there was no energy to sustain them. Reports from city archives describe individuals falling asleep in stairwells and not waking. Bodies were often left for days due to lack of transport and strength. Burial services operated sporadically. Mass graves were dug on the outskirts. Despite conditions, certain institutions continued to function. Libraries remained open with limited hours. Scientific institutes preserved research materials. The botanical garden maintained seed collections under extreme constraints. The road of life increased its capacity as winter progressed. Ice thickened, allowing heavier trucks. Convoys transported flour, sugar, and ammunition into the city and evacuated some civilians, primarily children and the severely ill. Still, the scale was insufficient to reverse shortages. Ration levels reached their lowest point in January 1942. Workers received 350 grams of bread per day. Dependents received 200 grams. These amounts provided fewer than 800 calories for most adults. Weight loss was universal. Some residents adapted by reducing activity to near immobility. They remained in bed for most of the day, conserving energy. Others attempted to continue working, believing that maintaining routine offered a form of resistance. Adaptation did not eliminate suffering. It created a narrow zone in which survival remained possible for a portion of the population. The system functioned without recovery, only stabilization at minimal levels. By March, temperatures began to rise. Snow melted slowly. Ice routes remained active. Mortality rates decreased slightly, though health remained fragile. The city had not recovered, but it had adjusted to prolonged deprivation. Even as civilian life contracted to the most basic routines, the administrative and cultural institutions of Leningrad did not fully cease. The city government remained in operation throughout the siege, issuing decrees, managing ration distribution, and maintaining records of population and mortality. These bureaucratic structures provided a framework of continuity, even when material conditions deteriorated. Factories resumed limited production during the spring of 1942. Power supplies were partially restored, and some equipment was repaired. Output focused on military goods, including shells, uniforms, and vehicle components. Workers often operated machines while seated due to physical weakness. Absenteeism was widespread, but employment remained tied to ration eligibility, reinforcing attendance despite declining productivity. Scientific institutions were preserved with particular care. The All-Union Institute of Plant Industry safeguarded one of the world's largest seed collections. Researchers protected stored grains and vegetables without consuming them, even during peak famine. Several scientists died of starvation while maintaining the archive, a fact documented in post-war records. Museums reopened gradually. The Hermitage resumed limited public access in 1942, with empty frames displayed where artworks had been evacuated. The intent was not tourism, but affirmation that cultural life persisted. Libraries loaned books. Concert halls organized small performances for factory workers and soldiers. Medical institutions adapted to crisis conditions. Hospitals lacked supplies, but basic triage systems were maintained. Doctors prioritized patients with higher chances of survival. Nutritional clinics monitored weight and edema, though treatments were limited to advice and minimal rations. Education continued in reduced form. Some schools reopened in warmer months. Class sizes were small. Instruction focused on core subjects. Many teachers had died or been evacuated. Children who attended were often undernourished and fatigued. Communication networks remained active. The city newspaper, Leningradskia Pravda, published regularly. Radio broadcasts transmitted news, speeches, and music. These channels served as the primary source of information and a tool for maintaining morale, though content was tightly controlled. Religious institutions operated quietly. Some churches and synagogues provided shelter and limited aid. Official records on their activities are incomplete, but survivor accounts confirm their presence. These functioning institutions did not alleviate hunger or cold, but they created a sense of structural persistence. The city was not abandoned by its own systems. It continued to operate as an administrative unit, even as individual survival became uncertain. The presence of these institutions reinforced a collective expectation of endurance. There was no official timeline for relief, no projected end. The continuation of routine suggested that survival was not an extraordinary act, but an ongoing requirement embedded in daily life. The highest mortality during the siege occurred between December 1941 and February 1942. Official Soviet records estimate that more than 600,000 civilians died during this period, primarily from starvation and cold. Other estimates place the number higher. Exact figures remain uncertain due to incomplete documentation and wartime censorship. Death became a visible part of the urban environment. Bodies were found in apartments, stairwells, and on sidewalks. Municipal services lacked the capacity to remove them promptly. Relatives often transported deceased family members on sleds to designated burial sites, where mass graves were prepared. The Piskarevskoye Memorial Cemetery later became the largest such site. Psychological strain manifested in various forms. Some residents experienced apathy, withdrawing from social contact. Others displayed irritability or confusion. Medical reports described cognitive impairment associated with prolonged malnutrition. Memory lapses, slowed speech, and difficulty concentrating were common. Time perception altered. Days were structured around ration distribution, but weeks and months blurred. Seasonal markers lost relevance. Many diaries from the period consist of brief entries focused solely on temperature, food quantities, and physical symptoms. Cannibalism occurred in isolated cases. Soviet authorities documented several hundred incidents, though the true number is unknown. These cases were investigated and prosecuted, but they represented a small fraction of the population. Their existence reflects the extremity of conditions rather than common behavior. Family structures weakened under strain. Parents were unable to care for children. Elderly residents depended on neighbors. Some households dissolved as members died or were evacuated. Social roles became unstable. Despite losses, public disorder remained limited. There were no large-scale riots or breakdown of authority. Compliance with ration systems and civil regulations continued. Historians attribute this to a combination of social discipline, limited physical capacity for unrest, and the absence of alternatives. Mental endurance relied on routine and collective identity. Official narratives emphasized the city's historical significance and duty. Many residents internalized these messages, framing survival as participation in a shared task rather than an individual struggle. As spring 1942 approached, mortality declined. Warmer temperatures reduced fuel needs. Ice routes across Lake Ladoga allowed more consistent supply. Evacuation of children and the severely ill increased. The psychological impact persisted. Survivors reported long-term health problems and emotional detachment. The experience left little room for personal reflection during the event itself. Survival required focus on immediate tasks, leaving interpretation for later years.